Good evening, and well, not good evening to those of you watching on YouTube. I already said good evening to the people who are actually here. So this is for you, YouTubers. Hello, and welcome to another lecture in Philosophy 101. Tonight, our job is to get straight on finishing up Goodman, and we've got a lot of things to cover still with Goodman, so I'm going to try to move as quickly through this stuff as possible. Like I said this morning, I'm very anxious and excited to get into the third phase of Goodman's reading because that's where all the action is happening here. That's the phase where we start talking about what standards for justification are there for making better worlds or worse worlds now that, if Goodman is right, we don't have access to the correspondence relation as a way of grounding truth claims. So we want to say like a claim or a world, a way of representing reality is true, or it has the truth. We can't do that with the correspondence relation according to Goodman. So what are we going to use instead? What can we work with from only our subjective toolkit in order to start talking about appropriateness of theories of like putting pictures together about the world? So I'm not going to waste any time. I want to go right into picking up where we left off this morning in the second section, where Goodman is describing all the different tools that we have at our disposal towards making worlds. So I feel pretty good with where we're at with the first one, this composition decomposition thing. The next thing that Goodman talks about as a way that we can create new worlds from old worlds, or the ways in which worlds can be different, or they can have differences going on with them, adjustments and modifications, has to do with what he calls weighting. And weighting is like of all the things that I think are true, what are the things that take on the greatest significance or that have the more prominent role to play in putting together my paradigm that tells me about everything about how reality is, this global representation, this thought that I have that sort of collates and integrates everything that I think is true. Well, one way in which worlds could differ has to do with weighting. So you can imagine, I mean, to see the contrast here, you can imagine two people who acknowledge all the same facts. They like have exactly the same beliefs, but they think that some of those facts are playing a more prominent role or a more important role in explaining what's going on, especially when it comes to things like explaining reality. Like, why are things the way that they are? You can definitely imagine how some of those things could be given greater weight or importance. Um, there's a word that I've become very, very fond of. It's this word, salience. Salience refers to like what sort of jumps out or what is prominent or what grabs attention. So, if I'm giving the lecture tonight, and if all of a sudden a big loud explosion happened in my neighborhood, like that is going to be the most salient element in my experience right now. That is going to take on a huge amount of importance. And those kinds of salience effects that are just like a part of sensation, like about where my attention gets directed from my sensory perceptions, that's like the hardwired version of salience. But there's also the soft-wired stuff, like what things I judge to be of more significance or importance than others. Certainly, one of the most prominent ways in which salience effects are going to be soft-wired happens through our moral and ethical theories, our beliefs about what has meaning, what has significance, what is of more value. Two people could totally agree on everything that they think is good and bad and still have huge amounts of disagreement over which of those things on the good and bad list, the like pro-con list, have the most priority or take the most precedence over the others. So that's another big way in which worlds are different. Um, Salience effects have also become really, really important to me in my own journeys in cognitive science. So much about what's happening with consciousness and how we think about things and how the mind just works seems to be around issues of salience, about how my attention gets drawn to some places rather than others. What jumps out? What's going to take prominence? And what's going to encourage me in the beliefs that I construct and the theories I construct about the world? Which things are going to take on the most importance? Another really good example I have for this kind of weighting thing, other than the ethical analogy, has to do with causality. When we talk about something causing something else, like say I've got a can of gasoline and I throw a lit match into it, and there's an explosion, we would say, what caused the explosion? It was like me throwing the lit match into the can of gasoline. But there's a lot of other causes that are in play in that scenario that are required in order to explain the effect. There's just a lot of them I don't pay attention to. There's a lot of background things that I might either take for granted or may not even be on my radar at all. Like in the case of the gasoline example, what we would certainly probably all acknowledge, but also would still take for granted, is that in that situation, there had to have been an oxygen environment. If I throw a lit match into a can of gasoline in a vacuum, no explosion. It's not going to happen. So would we say the oxygen caused the explosion? Well, it seems weird to say, but that is a part of the actual understanding of causally what's taking place here. There'd have to be the oxygen present in order for that to happen. So when we talk about causes, usually we're talking about not just something was involved in the causal process here, but it played some kind of central role in terms of importance. And that can be determined by so many different factors. What we are going to pick out as the proximate cause of something is something that is influenced by a lot of factors. Goodman is going to say a lot of this stuff is going to depend on our pragmatic projects of what do I want an explanation for. Probably I want an explanation for what causes gasoline explosions in order to prevent them from happening. And I can't really suck all the air out of that, all the oxygen out of the atmosphere, but I definitely can't avoid throwing a lit match into a can of gas. That's something I can do. So that's maybe the thing that is going to take more prominence. If you study statistical analysis in terms of like having data to explain or justify claims about causal relations, you're always going to run into this kind of fact about like what's the whole nexus of background conditions that may be playing a causal role, and what do we decide ultimately is required in order to call something a cause or even an effect of something else. That's going to get into some weighting issues. So, oh yeah, Rob, good point. How do you have a lit match in a vacuum? No, you can't do that. But I could, maybe I have some kind of like blowtorch or something. I don't know. I can. Oh crap! Ooh, I just spilled coffee all over my computer. Let me pause the recording. All right, sorry about that, guys. There's still a little coffee left too. Let's hope I don't make a mess of the rest of it. Okay. All right. So the next thing we've got is ordering, what Goodman calls ordering, and this is, I think, some of the good analogies here for understanding what Goodman has in mind here. Think just about like representing information. Goodman is talking about these worlds as ways of representing reality. That's like the core idea here of what makes a world what it is. It's a system of representation. So think about other kinds of systems of representation that we're familiar with. One of my favorites to use as an analogy here is a database. So a database is collecting a bunch of information, and it gives you some ability to like access that information and to represent it to yourself. Like maybe your database lets you perform, if it's a cool database and not one of those really archaic ones that you're working with, it'll let you like generate reports or do a graph or something to represent what's going on with the data it has collected inside of it. Think about ordering as, or let's kind of go through the other ones. Like you could have the data sorted, or you could have the database sensitive to certain categories, like certain types of information. For instance, if I've got a database, like I got a database on Canvas that's recording all your grades. That database doesn't just record what grades you have for assignment, but it also like lets me know if you turned it in late or not, or things like this. So that would be like increased fidelity, conceptual fidelity in the system, like we were talking about with composition and decomposition. Weighting could also be a factor here if I'm trying to do some like analytics to gauge like what are the things that are going to influence your overall grade, like those things are weighted in certain ways that the system's going to process. But think about ordering as like the way of accessing the information that's in the database. How is it actually stored and encoded? And in what ways am I able to access that information? If any of you guys have ever had to do work with really old databases, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because those old databases are really frustrating and how they let you access information and what kind of reports you can generate. I've definitely done one of those jobs, worked in database management for a summer when I was in college, and man, I had the worst, most archaic dinosaur program that we were working with, and it was constantly a struggle because we had all the information was in there, but we didn't have an ability to access it in a way that was easy to compare or generate other kinds of conclusions or things like that. So a lot of that is going to be not just the content of the information, but the syntax, the structural formal components about how that information is being encoded and how it's related to other pieces of information. That would be ordering. That would be in the category of ordering issues. Here's another big way in which ordering is going to change our worlds. Think about, let's go back to color. We've talked about color a couple times here, and Goodman's actually, there's another concept of color we'll get from Goodman. You guys have probably seen a color spectrum presented in a kind of linear graph like this, but you probably also have seen it, this would be like wavelength of light kind of thing. You probably have also seen it ordered in a kind of wheel, like a color wheel that turns back on itself. Those are two ways of representing the same information, but they have different structural ways of presenting that information, which allow us to reason about it in different ways. It's like more useful for some purposes rather than others. The wheel thing might make some more sense than the spectrum thing, depending on what we're trying to do with color. So that would be a difference in how I'm ordering what is essentially the same information. And sometimes the ordering can also contribute to what information is actually being encoded to. That can also happen. But this kind of distinction between semantics and syntax is a significant one. The final thing I want to mention about ordering is that, and this might be the most important way in which ordering manifests in our representational paradigms, our ways of looking at the world. And that has to do with order of derivation, what I would call order of derivation. Which claims are being used as the justification or support for the other claims that I believe are true. So you can imagine a system like, say, here's my world, and it's got a certain amount of beliefs that I possess. Like this world, says this is true, says that is true. It's got a bunch of facts that I acknowledge as true, that I believe are true. You could have two of these that are exactly the same in terms of all the beliefs that they have, but they think that like this one serves as the core that justifies all these other ones. And other ones would maybe think of it really going like, so the justification goes out this way. Other ones could see that the justification goes the other direction, that actually this is the belief that justifies this one being true. And that's going to make a really big difference when we're talking about the rationality of belief. Rationality is not just, our beliefs are not, the structure of our beliefs is not just like a list of facts that we accept are true. Our worlds are much more complicated with that. They're structured. They've got these support relations, so that if like, okay, let me give another, let's focus on one part of this diagram that I drew. So here are the two options. Either I think this belief justifies this one, or this belief justifies this one. Let's say the first one is proven false. What's going to happen to both of these systems? Well, in the first system, I'm going to have to get rid of this belief too, because its support just got undermined. And in the second one, I wouldn't have that happening. If this is the support for this, the fact that this is false doesn't mean this is going to be false necessarily. So these kind of logical relationships that happen with how we use some claims to support other claims is very, very significant. And that can make for all the difference in the world in terms of what is the meaning of the paradigms that we're running around with. So that's another bit from ordering that I think is really important. Okay, next one that Goodman talks about. Oh, and also keep in mind something. I mentioned this morning that there's kind of two main purposes that I think Goodman has for this whole second section of the reading. One of them is to kind of demonstrate that there is all this subjectivity that's going on whenever we're constructing worlds and paradigms for belief and theories or whatever. But the other purpose is so that we can just know the tools that we have in order to use them more effectively, to be more deliberate and intentional with how we go about this activity of world making. But that first one, I want to kind of connect the dots here for how the things that Goodman is talking about, these phenomenon here and ways of world making, show subjectivity. Certainly, if a belief justifies some other belief, that's more a matter of me, the knower, than about the truths themselves. It's more about like, in what way am I going to get access to these truths? Even if we're thinking about it on like the realist model of things, I'm like that there's a reality out there and I'm supposed to get contact with it. The ways that I'm going to try to learn about the world using things like rational justification has more to do with me and my relative knowledge and ignorance rather than anything about what's going on in the world. Like the world just is as it is. It doesn't have like rational justification or anything. It's just like, here's all these truths. Rational justification is required when I don't know, when I'm ignorant, and I'm trying to get to a position of knowledge. So that's another sign of how these different dynamics are a matter of subjectivity, about how we're thinking about things rather than just how things are in themselves. A couple questions have come up here in the... Okay. All right. So Rob's asking, he asks, are we talking ordering within worlds or ordering the different worlds? Or you don't understand if ordering is only within a world or also ordering between worlds. Remember, for Goodman, it's not going to matter one way or the other. This is something that I didn't emphasize as much in my lecture in class, but early on in the reading, Goodman talks about this pluralism monism thing, about like, is there one world or are there many worlds? And we did talk about this part in class. Remember, Goodman is saying that we need to endorse many worlds because we don't have the ability to reduce them to one yet. It would be really nice if we could do that, but we can't really do that without a loss of information and meaning. We'd be losing at some kind of part of reality here. So, the way Goodman is thinking about it is he thinks, I've got a bunch of different worlds that I'm working on here. Let's get that in the camera here. I got a bunch of different paradigms that I'm using to navigate my experience and make sense of reality. And so when I talk about ordering, that might also involve these like subsets, these worlds, how I'm trying to like integrate them together. But in some cases, I won't be able to relate some of these worlds to other worlds. I'd like to if I can. I'd love to have some paradigm, the bigger paradigm that holds these two and negotiates a kind of translation between them or some kind of integration. But if I can't do that, then I am going to have to kind of keep them separate. So maybe the ordering might just happen within worlds or not. But this is another part. This is also part of composition decomposition, that I can take whole paradigms and relate them to each other in this sort of thing, and that can be useful. Goodman would say kind of like there is a natural tendency for why we might want to be interested in like say when we ask questions about like, are all the world's religions kind of getting at the same thing or not? Like it would, if there is really like some common truth here that's going on, getting at that would maybe be more useful than having that truth represented by just a very idiosyncratic conceptual paradigm. That might be more powerful and more useful. But also, when we're worried about reducing them all to just one thing, we might think that like in doing that, we might be forcing something and losing something that makes them unique and special and different. That they might have certain contributions to make that can't be reducible to each other. So we can't have our cake and eat it too. That could be a problem there. But so the quick answer to your question, Rob, is that it doesn't matter whether we're talking within a world or between worlds. These are the tools that we've got for anything in how we play around with worlds. It's gonna work both ways. Like worlds can contain other worlds as subsets. Yeah. I'm gonna pause for a second. Okay. Another dynamic here. So other than this ordering thing is what Goodman calls deletion and supplementation. And this is also going to be kind of like a no-brainer. I've got a world with certain components in it, and I can bring in something new, and that's going to change my world, or I could drop something. I could take something out of the world. Think about it like if the world is like my set of beliefs, I can adopt some new beliefs, or I can drop some old beliefs. That's kind of like the software version of it. Goodman also calls to mind some of the really interesting hardwired versions of these sorts of things. For example, I'm just gonna like forget some things naturally. Like they're just gonna fall away. I'm not gonna have access to them anymore. It's like the memory degrades and I lose contact with that, and that's gonna create a different world automatically. So deletion is kind of just like a natural thing that's always happening, and I actually might even need to construct some ways in my world of accommodating that feature of reality. That'll make things a little more difficult, but the supplementation stuff is the stuff that's really crazy to me. So there's a bunch of examples of this. That one big one here is what we sometimes refer to as poverty of the stimulus. That the sensations that I get from reality are showing me only a very small portion of what is possible, of what's going on. Descartes talks about this when he talks about the crazy wax thing. You remember that wax portion of the Meditations where he's like, look at this wax and like, what is the wax? And I change these properties and everything. He considers for a moment that maybe what the wax is all of the possible transformations that this wax thing could undergo under various conditions. But really, the content of what I've got is way too limited for that. I don't see all those things. I don't know what would happen if this cup was traveling at like 50% the speed of light or something like that. Like there's a lot of weird circumstances that I wouldn't be able to anticipate or imagine that compose like my belief or thought about what's going on with this object. But that's not required. It's not like my thoughts about objects are totally exhausted merely by the content of sensation I have of perceiving those objects. My mind fills in a lot, even if I don't know exactly what's going on. Let me give you an example here. So this came in the mail today, this weird brochure thing, and I actually haven't looked at the other side. I have no idea what the other side of this thing looks like. But guess what? When I think about this object, I definitely imagine that there's something on the other side, right? It's not like I just imagine, oh, this object is a big void on the back or something. I know that if I were to turn this thing around, I would have a certain determinant experience. Yep, there we go. I didn't know what this was gonna. I didn't know that there was gonna be that face on the poster, but boom, there was something there. I definitely imagined that there was, even though I hadn't seen it. That I anticipate certain things. My imagination kind of fills in the cracks, or at least the way that I'm conceiving of this object allows for there being these other experiences which I have not had. That is part of how I think about reality too. I'm constantly supplementing what I actually receive in sensation. I don't just limit myself to just what I get in sensation, even if I'm trying to be a good empiricist. It's impossible for me to do this sort of thing entirely. So that's one big issue. Some of the other really crazy ones here are, well, like here, the illusion of motion perception is a very classic one. So you know that when you go to a movie, you watch a movie, you're actually not seeing objects in motion. Not even on this video screen, you're not seeing objects in motion right now at all. All you're getting is a bunch of still images that are being flashed in rapid succession, one after the other, and your brain does the rest of it. This is another hardwiring subjectivity getting into our thoughts about reality. That what we think is actually going on in reality can be just a projection of how we are processing subjectively the input that we do get from sensation. So this is an example of that. And there's actually been some very interesting studies on this effect that go even deeper. Here the occluded object test is my favorite. So here's an experiment that was run. It's set up like this. And this first version is very standard. You got two lights, and you put them in front of an observer, and you flash this one and then this one in rapid succession. And what do people report that they see? They don't see two lights flashing. What they actually experience consciously is the light moving from one location to another location. Every time you've seen those reader boards, you know, just the big bulb lights like on a marquee or something, where it's got like a scrolling text, or like the stock market exchange, like that little ticker thing that goes with where all the stock prices are happening. That's this kind of phenomenon going on. You see it as motion when there's really no motion taking place at all. But this is a pretty dramatic effect, but it gets crazier. They also did the exact same experiment, but where there was a very clear occlusion that was put between the two lights. So you've got this like a little wall that's put like this between the two lights. Guess what people reported seeing when the lights were flashed in close succession? They didn't see the light moving like this. That's not what happened. But they actually reported consciously perceiving, in consciousness, is this. That's crazy. They saw the light moving in this loop-shaped thing. Not straight across the occlusion, but whoop! They've also tried it with like flashing a square light and a triangle light. And people see in between a kind of weird morphed like triangle square thing as it transforms smoothly from one shape to another. Really, really crazy stuff like this. That's not coming from your senses. That's not sense data or something. This is the brain pretty actively playing a role in what you directly perceive. So the kind of the realist image here that just what's happening in perception is a direct reflection of what's happening in reality, that looks to be false, at least universally. Okay. And again, remember, like I said, realism is not dead. I said that this morning in class. Realism isn't dead, but subjectivism has got some good evidence on their side here. So about how much that's going. But these effects might be able to be explained by a realist too. I just won't get into that right now. Here's a couple more that are favorites of mine about this whole supplementation, the way that the mind supplements what I actually directly receive as sensory input in constructing my perception of the world and my thinking about it. And these ones are kind of like a mix of hard and soft wire, I think. The first one is narrative meanings. So actually, this is a perfect example. Reading a comic book, you get a bunch of like still events, right? These like little snapshots of what happens. But when you, like, let's say I draw in the first frame, I draw a dude like this, and then like this, and then like that. So here, look, take a look. What do you think happened here? Probably something like he fell over. But you don't actually see what actually transpired here. You just put the images into a certain pattern. In order to make sense of the images, you try to imagine some kind of narrative framework in which those singular episodes or singular events could be related to each other in some sensible way. And this kind of way that we look for narratives as a way of finding meaning in things is very, very prominent to how we make sense of reality. It's something that if you're like really serious in studying history, this is a constant danger that you're running up against. That you are like, let's say you find out that this fact happened and this fact happened, like you got all these evidence for these little data points. How you're going to put together a narrative about what's going on here, of like what really caused this event to happen. You got to be very careful that the correlation is not all you've got for just justifying causation. This is a big problem. But it's the only way that sort of like we can really proceed when we're trying to interpret what really happened in history. We got to like assign some kind of narrative to it in order to make sense of it. This is a big way in which we find meaning in our lives. And sometimes it steers us wrong, and sometimes it steers us right too. So this is another big thing that influences how we construct the different worlds that we have. So we're going to prefer a world that has a tighter narrative connection than one that doesn't. Here's another one that's very similar to the narrative stance. In philosophy, we call it the intentional stance. The intentional stance is a way that I interpret the events that are taking place in perception. So most prominent example would be something like conversation, human communication. You say some words, and I'm like, that's weird. Why did you say what you said? What's going on here? In order to make sense of it, in order to maybe also interpret what you really meant, I'm going to have to adopt the intentional stance. What that means is I'm going to look at your behavior in light of you doing things for reasons, that I'm going to interpret that there was intention behind the events that transpired in a way to try to make sense of them or to capture your meaning or something like that. I have to be like, in order to interpret your weird, strange utterance, I have to assume they must have said, I know it's weird, but there must have been some reason for why they said what they did. If I can just figure out what that is, I can figure out what they really meant, or I'll have what I need to make that interpretation. This also kind of gets into things like, say, using something like God to try to explain natural phenomenon or events that happen in your life. That I'm like, if I think about events that happen in my life, being like, what was God trying to teach me there, or something like that, I'm adopting the intentional stance about the events that took place in my own life. If I'm like, there must have been a meaning or purpose behind it, I'm adopting the intentional stance. And the weird thing about the intentional stance, sometimes you might think this is another one like the narrative meanings, where, pardon me, little sneeze, it was coming on. You might think that this is something that's just going to create tons of bias, that it's actually like misleading us. But it's also something that's totally crucial for me to be able to make sense of reality. If I couldn't do this, if I couldn't adopt the intentional stance, then there's no way that I would be able to make sense of human communication. That's probably the most important thing. When I'm dealing with actual minds, then I would need to adopt the intentional stance in order to do this, in order to affect communication. That would be absolutely important. So these are ways that we process what we actually get from experience and make meaning out of it in putting together our actual worldviews, our actual beliefs about how we represent reality to us. Before I leave this point about like how these subjective elements might have the problem of bias, and I use religion as an example. I mean, even science has got this kind of issue too, because a lot of arguments in science are not just like statistical generalizations. I'm not just like taking a bunch of data and then trying to pick out what I think are the salient elements in that data, like the way that we do statistical analytics or something like that. A big part of also how people scientifically reason when they're constructing theories, natural theories, is to use an argument called inference to the best explanation. From my work in cognitive science, cognitive science is a baby field. It's just getting its feet under it as an empirical study. And at the present moment, I would say pretty much all of the arguments that are taking place in cognitive science are based on inference to the best explanation. We've got some things observable, but we don't know how to explain them. And we construct different models of mind to try to explain why people have the observed abilities that they do cognitively. And when they have different abilities, what explains that sort of thing. So, and inference to the best explanation is always based on standards of what makes for a good explanation. And that has more to do with human subjective rational standards than it does anything about direct truth. It's not like we have any direct proof for anything that we're making this inference the best explanation as a way to like try to defend these theories. But that doesn't make them irrational. And it's totally legitimate to argue in this sort of way to generate like something that's in inference to the best explanation. But that's still definitely short of something like proof. And we might be worried that the things that make sense to us, that cause us to treat something as the best explanation, might not be good enough to really justify it ultimately, or that might be a very fallible way of proceeding, and we might be steered wrong by this sort of subjective way that we have to think about things. So those questions are all still there. Remember, Goodman at this point is not telling us about what we should do, just what we can do. What are the things that we work with in trying to construct worlds? Okay, one final one, and then we can get past the second section. And that's what Goodman has to say about deformation. So some of these are hardwired, like for example, I showed you this one I think the other night, but the Moeller-Lyer illusion, this thing about those lines are actually the same length, but they appear to us to be different. There are these kinds of distorting effects that happen in perception that we can't really do anything about. They're kind of hardwired into how we process visual information. But the soft wiring stuff would be things like Goodman's example of the scientist. Like when I do an experiment and I collect, a bunch of data points, and I'm saying, it kind of works like this, that if I draw a curve or a line to try to describe this relation, that is a distortion of the data. I'm like twisting I don't draw the line like, like this to try to fit the data. I distort it slightly because it seems more sensible and simple and straightforward as an explanation. I don't think that the universe is working under principles that are very ad hoc and specific, I assume that reality must be playing by fairly simple laws, that these force relationships are actually fairly simple in principle, and then I distort the data to reflect that sort of thing. So that's also a kind of deformation that Goodman is trying to just get us to own up to it. He's not saying that we're doing something wrong if we're doing this. This is a big point about it. It's not like by showing the subjectivity of our thinking about reality and all of our beliefs about reality that Goodman's trying to undermine the legitimacy of these things. That would only happen if we needed something like the correspondence relation of truth in order to have a justifiable basis for talk of truth. And Goodman is trying to give us something else. So keep that in mind in looking at these arguments. In fact, I got some quotes I want to read to you guys that kind of reflect this point. And this will be a nice little transition here into the third section of the reading, where Goodman wants to answer this question about, okay, if we don't have the correspondence relation as a standard for truth, what are we going to use as a way of deciding what to believe? What would actually count as rational justification here? Or is it just a total chaos free-for-all like relativism says? Goodman doesn't want to be a relativist. Remember that. Okay. So here's some quotes I want to read to you that I think are kind of suggestive. And I'd really like to do this in class and kind of have a little discussion about them, but we don't have that luxury. So I'm going to read them to you, and you can think about them for yourself. But I think that these are very suggestive of what Goodman has in mind. These are very important quotes. He says, what makes for a good world? Well, he says, aversion is to be taken to be true when it offends no unyielding beliefs and none of its own precepts. This is kind of an issue of coherence. We're going to talk about coherence a little bit more later on as a standard, but here's a kind of introductory version of it. Or maybe this will be good enough, but I like to talk about this as internal and external coherence. So let's say, all right, so here's my whole world, and like here's all my world paradigms. I keep drawing all these like circles with circles in them. So here's all of my different world paradigms, and collectively together, let's call that my ontology, my worldview. And let's say I got this specific theory in here that I subscribe to, like maybe string theory, which is a theory that physics theory that is completely based on inference to best explanation. By the way, interestingly enough, that's why some scientists don't like it. Okay, but let's say I got this theory that I subscribe to. There's two ways in which I could have a problem with this theory in terms of coherence. One way is if it's self-contradictory, where like different elements in it, in the theory itself, like the claims that make up the theory, are in tension, that they contradict or challenge each other, that it's going to be hard to see how both of them are going to be true simultaneously. That kind of internal incoherence is a big problem. That might make it, if it's a big enough deal, we'd say the theory is sort of self-defeating. Like say what Plato was saying about the relativism in his argument that relativism is self-defeating. It's that it can't be consistently maintained, applied into these like contexts that involve relativism itself. That it's going to get into tension with itself. So that might be a problem and a reason for saying this is a bad theory and I shouldn't believe it. Here's another one. Let's say I have some observation. New observation happens, like scientists do some experiment, and that observation is in tension with the theory that we previously held. So there's a problem here. The theory on it, like this would be a good example, or a good example of this would be Newton's laws. Nice, consistent theory, made a lot of sense. No contradictions in it. Very elegant, incredible theory, Newton's theory. But then we started making some observations that did not fit with the predictions that the theory made about what should be happening in those situations. That made for a problem. And we couldn't do anything to explain these results away. That's what Goodman means by unyielding. So we had to kind of maybe ditch the theory. They were like, this theory won't work. And we need a better theory that is going to be consistent with this information, that's capable of bringing this information in, integrating it cleanly, and not having a contradiction. I would much prefer that. If I can get away with that, that's great. If I can't, I might just have to be comfortable with a mystery. Might have to do that. But if I can come up with another theory that deals with that, then that's definitely going to be preferable. So that's one thing that's an initial thought here of what might make a world better than another one. Here's another thing, another quote from Goodman about rightness of rendering, or the standards that we have for our different paradigms. He says, "Truth, far from being a solemn and severe master, is a docile and obedient servant." That's a provocative little statement right there. What do we think Goodman might have in mind here? What does he want to say with that claim? Truth, far from being a solemn and severe master, is a docile and obedient servant. You know, in that realism view, when I'm thinking about a correspondence between how reality is and my beliefs and perceptions of it, seems like reality itself doesn't care about what I think. It's not accommodating me. It's not like negotiating truth with me or something like that. It just is how it is, and I'm either right about it or I'm wrong. And I think that's the part about this solemn, severe master thing, that it's this sort of like absolute, uncompromising standard. But as soon as we start recognizing that whatever is making up our concept of truth can't be that, because we have no access to how reality is in and of itself, like we've been talking about in the lectures so far, then what is truth? I think Goodman is saying here that whatever we're going to use as our standards for truth are really not so uncompromising, that they actually are pretty flexible and they are adaptive to different situations. Here's another quote that kind of supports or is in line with that sentiment on Goodman's part. He says, "The scientist seeks system, simplicity, scope, and when satisfied on these scores," all this alliteration, Goodman. "The scientist seeks system, simplicity, scope, and when satisfied on these scores, he tailors truth to fit. He as much decrees as discovers the laws he sets forth, as much designs as discerns the patterns he delineates." So much alliteration. Oh, but it makes for a nice quote, huh? This is exactly what Goodman is talking that we were talking about before when we were talking about this whole like generating the curve to fit the data sort of thing. So if my theoretical system for explaining physical phenomenon is systematic, nice and simple, like we already talked about, it has scope, it applies to a broad enough range of circumstances, then I'm going to be happy with going with whatever fits those kinds of rational standards for what I think a good theory ought to be able to do. I've got these like rational expectations for a good theory, and I'll maneuver the data to kind of fit in with that. And this is not a problem. Remember, Goodman doesn't think that this is wrong. He thinks this is exactly right. This is like how we should be doing things. We need to find a way to relate diverse experiences to each other, and in the process there might need to be some deformation in order to do this, as long as the deformation isn't resulting in a loss of important information along the way, like Goodman was talking about with his concerns about a reduction that's inappropriate. It'd be a reduction that involves a loss of meaningful information. Like if I reduce my experience, my complex and deep experience of art, to just certain neurons firing in my brain, then we're going to lose something in the process there. And Goodman doesn't think that's worth the cost. There's another quote that's related to this that I want to read. Let me pull it up. I actually have it in the reading. It's on page 19. Where are you? Yeah, here we go. Gosh, I love this quote. There's a lot of good quotes in this reading. I love this reading. I'm a little bit of a fanboy for this stuff. My apologies. I'll try not to gush too much more. Okay, Goodman says, "The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth would thus be a perverse and paralyzing policy," more alliteration, "for any world maker. The whole truth is too much. It is too vast, variable, and clogged with trivia. The truth alone would be too little, for some right versions are not true, like this one. It's not technically true, but it's still right. It still like meets certain criteria of appropriateness for how we build a world. And even for true versions, even for theories that are in fact true, rightness may matter more." And let's talk about this. This is one of Goodman's really core concepts when we start talking about rightness of rendering or what's going to make for a good world and what's a bad world. The big idea that Goodman wants to kind of convince us of is that first off, the correspondence theory of truth is not a standard that is operable. We can't use it, so we got to use something else. And that's to understand truth. That just my concept of truth is composed of different standards other than the correspondence theory. What those are, that's difficult. We're going to talk in a second about what those standards might be. But this other thing about rightness, there might be other factors that contribute to whether a worldview is appropriate for me to hold that don't have anything to do with truth directly. They have more to do with things like our pragmatic projects of what we care about, what we want a theory for. Think, for example, if I'm okay, let's say I'm a bridge builder. I'm an engineer. I want to build good bridges. Well, guess what? I don't need to be an expert in quantum mechanics or even relativity in order to build good bridges. All I need is Newton. I need Newton's laws. That'll give me all the guidance I need to build a bridge that's not going to fall down. We don't have to worry about relativistic effects or like time dilation or crap like that when I'm building a bridge, because it just doesn't fit into those contexts. The way in which Newton's theory is untrue, which it is untrue, Newton's theory has been proven false, is not going to matter pragmatically. That's an example of rightness that Goodman's trying to get at. It's this pragmatic usefulness, that if the belief gets the job done, that matters. And whether it can get the job done matters too. Truth is also something we care about. Goodman isn't kind of dismissing truth entirely as something that's irrelevant or has no value on its own. He does think that it matters. I do care that my beliefs are true, but I also care about these other things. I care about these pragmatic projects. I remember we talked before about how these Goodman worlds they perform two functions for us. They help us unify experience, and they help us have some guidance about how to act in response to the world. It informs decision making. Those are practical, pragmatic functions, even if it's something theoretical. So even if, like, say, I'm trying to design a physics theory that explains what's going on with the Big Hadron Collider, like this massive Hadron Collider that we have. They've been able to send particles smashing into each other at higher velocities and thus more energy. And what happens when they crash into each other is that all these new particles we've never observed before pop into existence and then pop out of existence, usually shortly thereafter. This big collision of subatomic particles creates these new particles that we've never observed before. What's going on with that? I want an explanation. Why? Well, it doesn't really do anything for me pragmatically other than it explains why what happened. That's a theoretical type of pragmatic goal. I want an explanation. If something can give me an explanation, yay, that's what I wanted out of a theory. That would be a sign of a good theory. That's it doing its job. And if a theory can't do its job, then that's a reason I'm not going to care about it, even if it is maybe getting at things that are true. It might not fit with all of the desiderata that I have for a good explanation. So those are some examples here about this rightness thing. I hope that this is making sense. Let's see what's going on here in the chat. Yeah, let's take a little time out for this. Lawrence is asking about basically preferences, the kind of subjectivity that's involved in preferences. You're wording them as naturally subjective concepts, like person A likes red, but person B likes blue. And we want to be careful here. I mean, the color things, color properties are notoriously difficult to ontologize. And what's the right way to think about color properties is difficult. One option on the table is this thing I've referred to you guys before as qualia, spelled like this. Qualia are like the phenomenal properties in consciousness of what it is like to have a certain experience. So what it is like to see red. Not anything about the surface reflectance properties of a red object or what's going on with my retinas and how they're sending signals to my brain processing in a certain way, but the like what it's like redness stuff. That is a certain qualia property that might be subjective in a way that is sort of those sorts of things might be so completely subjective that I can't do any comparison because I don't see what you're experiencing in your consciousness when you look at colors. I can't have direct access to that. I'm not telepathic, right? I'd need telepathy to be able to do something like that. So I can never confirm whether you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing or something like that. That's one issue aside. But this thing about preferences, about liking something, that's also that's a different matter of subjectivity here. There is a way that, like Alexa, you're trying to reduce it to kind of like there are truth claims about whether someone has a certain preference. That's true. But whether something is so if we just say like it's a fact that I like something, then that we can handle kind of the way we would deal with other facts. At least like things like there's a little bit of coffee left in my cup because I didn't spill it all over my computer. We can treat it like that. Like I can talk about what you believe even if I don't believe what you believe. I can talk about the facts about what subjective state you are in. I can do that. But the more interesting thing here is like normative properties, like whether something is valuable, whether something is good, whether something is right or wrong. Those kinds of properties are also subjective. And whether there's the possibility here of objective universal truth with regard to value or moral and ethical properties, I'm going to leave that aside for right now. That's a big debate. It's one of the biggest debates in ethical theory. And it definitely seems to, it's going to work, it's going to play out probably a little differently than it will for like descriptive claims that don't have this normative content to them. So I'm gonna kind of hold off on that, but this is something we definitely talk about, and I'd love to talk to you guys about sometime. Okay, all right, I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so here's another very important claim that Goodman makes here when we start thinking about rightness of rendering and what's going on with evaluating the worlds that we construct. Remember, Goodman's really big on this whole. I'll get to the code word. You guys are thanks for reminding me, guys. I'll get to it. You guys want it just now? I guess we could just do it now. I'm going to talk for a while longer here, but let's do. Let's do hypercube. Philosophy Club. We were talking about hypercubes today, and how we have to subjectively represent multiple dimensions to ourselves in ways that are consistent with how we can think about them. So hypercube, that's a code word. None of you guys would have guessed that was the code word, right? Yeah, that's a good code word. Okay, so remember, Goodman is a big fan of pluralism. He likes, he's got this willingness to accommodate tension and incompatibility in the worlds that he's willing to endorse, as long as they're pulling their weight. They're doing some work for us, whether that's theoretical explanatory work or whether it's just a matter of like recognizing. Oh, is the mic back? It's back? Okay, good. Woo! Oh no. When did the mic go out? What did I last say? Oh no. 15 seconds? Crap. Okay, all right. Let me try to go back in time in my mind. Okay, just to be safe, I'm gonna go back a little bit. Okay, so remember, Goodman really likes pluralism. He wants to accommodate worlds even if they're kind of incompatible or I don't know how to translate them all to one reductive paradigm, that sort of thing. Okay, so he likes pluralism. He's willing to tolerate those kinds of tensions and inconsistencies between paradigms as long as they're doing important pragmatic work for us. In general, that's going to be Goodman's position on this. However, he says, a willingness to be like inclusive to a multitude of worlds, like to adopt a kind of pluralistic worldview, is no substitute for critical standards. So in other words, I can't just like say, oh, well, you know, truth is probably very complex and we should just like let in any worldview that we can imagine and like say it's got some contribution to truth or something like that. Goodman's really, really worried about that. He thinks that's going to degenerate into relativism. Relativism has all sorts of classic complaints to it, but he has a new way of kind of putting the complaint too that I kind of like. I like this phrasing for it. He's worried about making that pluralism would make being true be too easy. That there are real concerns here about how we build an ontology and what is going to work better and what's not going to work better. What's going to actually fulfill the goals of what we want for a theory and what's not going to fulfill goals of a theory. Basically, there's ways that we can definitely be organizing experience in a way that's not very efficient or useful, or organizing it in a way that isn't helpful for me making decisions about how I should act in the world and what I should do. Both of those functions, we could be doing a better job or a worse job. I can't do everything all the time. Like, especially when it comes to decision making, I got to chart some particular life. I got to make decisions about this. And not all the values that I might be interested in accepting or making room for are going to be compatible with each other. Even if, like, and let's kind of put this into the context of something you might be worried about, which might be tolerance. So you might say, like, well, I can't live everyone's life, but every way other people are doing it, that's different from me. That's fine, no problems there. But think about what's going on with your own decisions. I think if you really sincerely reflect on it, you won't be comfortable with any possible way in which you could live. But there's certain decisions that whether you made them or other people, you're like, that's not a good decision. Like, for instance, let's talk like about a racist paradigm. Let's say the world paradigm, the way that I look at the world, the way that I make sense of it is like deeply prejudiced and does not see equality in humanity or something like that. That worldview is definitely going to inform how I act in the world, and it's probably going to get me to act in ways that we're going to consider inappropriate and unjustified, if there's an ethical problem with it. In order to make that kind of judgment, we'd have to have some kind of standards that we're holding these worldviews accountable to. We've got to do that. And that's what Goodman definitely wants to do. We'll talk more about relativism and the kind of challenge that it poses here when we get to Williams, which is our next reading. But let's just kind of understand what Goodman is going to try to do in getting at this rightness of rendering thing. How is he going to try to cash this out? And he gives us a few tools to do this. Some of which I've already mentioned, and the other ones I want to review quickly for you. And I know we're coming up on 58 minutes here on my recording, and about an hour for all of you guys who have been with me through the trials and tribulations tonight. But I definitely want to get this last material on the table for us. So let's do it. I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. Let's start with I'm going to kind of reorganize the way I was going to give this lecture to maybe make it a little bit more efficient. Let's talk about the three standards that Goodman gives for how we can make truth claims. So these are beyond just the pragmatic projects of what is going to work. We could talk about what's going to work for truth. What are the standards we're going to use for truth? One option is just pragmatism itself. We could take our concern for being able to fulfill the projects that we're interested in as a criterion for truth. And this is what philosophical pragmatism believes. It says, who cares about truth? Truth doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is usefulness. And anything that we're going to talk about as being true is really just going to be a product of whatever works. Whatever gets the job done. The reason why I throw out a scientific theory when I have evidence that disproves it is just because that evidence shows that the theory can't explain everything. It's got a pragmatic failure. It's not able to explain this thing. It delivers a prediction that does not match with my experience. And that is a problem for the theory. The theory cannot do what it's trying to do, and so I should get rid of it in favor of a theory that can do what I want it to do. This is pragmatism. It says, we're not going to make any real claims about what's really going on in reality. We're just going to adopt beliefs that fit with the purposes that we want beliefs for. And maybe we can have some debates about what are the appropriate purposes for beliefs. We can get into this kind of second level debate about what pragmatic goals are appropriate. But ultimately, the cash value for any truth is always going to be what I can do with it, what it accomplishes for me, what kind of tasks it lets me succeed at. So that's pragmatism. That's one option. And certainly there are some, you could say, facts about this. There's a way in which I can rationally evaluate whether a certain belief is going to result the desired effect of whether this belief really does give me a platform from which to integrate these truths or not integrate these truths. And we can have debates about that, and we can start pursuing this kind of universal objective truth sort of thing with regard to the pragmatic standard. Here's the next one. Coherence, which we've already talked about. This internal-external coherence thing. One way of thinking about the rules of logic itself are just ways to get my beliefs to be rationally consistent with each other. And logic will show me when there's sort of contradictions between the beliefs that I have. And that would be a problem. This kind of standard is kind of like what some philosophers have talked about in the last couple decades as reflective equilibrium. So let's say I've got two beliefs that are in tension. There we go. Two beliefs in tension. I've got a couple options here for how I can resolve the tension. One option is to just get rid of one of the offending parties. I could just stop believing this one or stop believing that one. The other option, though, is I could find some third belief that allows me that accommodates both of these two beliefs which are in tension to each other in a way that sort of quarantines them from each other. I like to explain this as like, you've got two people at a party that can't stop fighting with each other. If you put them in the same room, big fight. Can't have that. No good. That's going to ruin the party. So you put them in separate rooms. Problem solved. There you go. You can have both of them continue to go at the party. You don't have to kick one of them out, as long as you can find some way to like maybe constrain the beliefs to say like, well, this one is true within this context, and this one is true within this context. And as long as we're being very specific about what the conditions are for that context, this is not relativism. This is just saying that truth is more contextually specific, and that is an objective claim that you could make. Okay, so this kind of like options for making coherence happen is another thing that we could use as a standard. Let me give you another kind of model to kind of give you a narrative of what's going on here. So again, here's my huge Goodman-esque worldview that I'm working with. And imagine it's like that this time when I draw the circle here, that there's sort of tiers. There's like these gradated steps of my beliefs. And the beliefs that are here in the center are the ones that are like really central and important. They have to do with lots of aspects of life. They're not very specific claims. They're ones that have relevance to almost anything. Like basic foundational beliefs and assumptions that I have about how the world works, or maybe my like deepest philosophical assumptions. And then as I'm having new experiences, there's little beliefs that are kind of coming in from the outside. Like, and a lot of these things are trivial, like what I had for dinner last night, or what you said to me, or something that happened in our relationship as time transpired. And sometimes one of these little new pieces of information, I'm constantly like absorbing new experiences and integrating them into my system of beliefs. Sometimes the way that some of these things can get integrated can eventually create some kind of conflict. That as I'm working with this belief, as it kind of works its way to the center and becomes more and more important, and so with this one, then sometimes things that developed from opposite sides of the block can start to get into conflict. And then I got to find some way to resolve them. And then this reflective equilibrium thing could be a way to do that. So asking for coherence is one standard that I can leverage to try to figure out what's a better world and what's a worse world. So a world that's got a lot of inconsistencies in it, that's not going to be a good one. And one that has a lot of consistencies is able to integrate a lot of information and a lot of perspectives, that's more powerful as a system, and that's a better theory to endorse. Kind of this like breadth of explanatory power is maybe a big deal for how to endorse certain paradigms over others. As those are some that might be more valuable and thus more appropriate. So this sort of rightness of rendering thing. And then we've got this idea of confidence. Confidence standards are kind of interesting. They're kind of like what Descartes is up to. You know, Descartes' like foundationalist epistemology that, you know, he's like, I got total confidence in the coito. I have total confidence that I know that I exist. Because I can't possibly doubt it. Maybe I can build things from there. Maybe there's other things that I have more confidence in than other things. Maybe things like direct perception about things when I haven't drank a bunch of beer or done a bunch of drugs, or I'm like totally sleep deprived and loony or something like that. Or I'm in a lot of pain. Under nominal circumstances, the sorts of things that I get in direct perception, I have more confidence about than other sorts of claims, like speculations on what's going on in Afghanistan right now, or in the political makeup of Afghanistan. Like, if I start making speculations about that, I don't have a lot of confidence about them. And maybe for ways that we could articulate, we can set some sort of standards here of what things get more confidence and which things get less. Sort of rational standards of, say, inference to the best explanation, or other types of inductive reasoning, which you can study in Philosophy 115. Great class. I highly recommend it. It's called Critical Reasoning, and it follows all the standards of informal logic. Those standards could also maybe be used as a standard of confidence. That we're going to say whatever is the output of these reasoning processes carries more weight and authority in how we should, and it justifies a more prominent position in this worldview that I'm constructing. That's another kind of option here. So these are all, basically Goodman's trying to make this point, that even without the correspondence relation, we got a lot to work with here. There are a lot of standards that we can use, and we can talk about universal objective truth using those kinds of standards. It's going to look a little different, though, and I want to kind of help you connect the dots a little bit. Think about it like this. We've got some ideal, like a rational subjective ideal. I want to have I want to be able to have one reductive paradigm that's able to assimilate and integrate without any loss or distortion of information all the other paradigms that I could possibly subscribe to or create that meet certain other standards. I want paradigms that have maximal consistency and coherence. I want theories that are going to be able to empower me to make every decision that I need to make in my life, that are going to help me integrate every possible experience that I could possibly have as a human being. A paradigm with that kind of power, that kind of theoretical power, is an ideal that we will never be able to achieve. But it's also an ideal that we can, in principle, define. And if we want to talk about this as objective universal truth, that's going to be pretty darn close to what the realist is looking for when it comes to all functional and practical purposes. And all the theories that we have are maybe somewhere on this spectrum, but the fact that there's an ideal, even an impossible theoretical ideal, gives me a standard that I can start to use to evaluate the different paradigms that I am considering endorsing, and allows me to talk about something like universal objective truth. It gives me some place at which truth can converge. Just the same way that we were talking about truth when we were talking about the code of intellectual conduct, when we were talking about being truth seekers. We wanted to, it wasn't because we thought that we could have the truth and answer all the questions or something like this, but that in having the debate, we're getting closer, we're making some progress in entertaining all the different considerations that might affect what I'm going to think is a rationally justified belief and what's rationally unjustified, that we're making some progress on this, and in order to do this, there needs to be some kind of standard. There needs to be some kind of objective universal truth in order for me to see us as making some progress on it, or for me to be able to even identify that there's some mistake that needs to be corrected or something like this. So I think this is how I think Goodman thinks it's going to work. Instead of that solemn, severe master version of truth that you get out of the correspondence relation, it's more like this rational ideal for what we should be up to subjectively, like a moral ideal. We're never perfect morally, but there's still a difference between right and wrong. And there's still maybe ways in which we can be making better decisions and improving our moral character, or backsliding and becoming morally worse. Same thing here with my abilities or virtues at creating good rational theories, that they could be approaching that ideal or moving away from it. And so Goodman thinks there still are standards that we can use to ground a notion of objective universal truth, even though they're all purely subjective. They're just a matter of the rules about how we have to think about things and what we do have access to, about what we want to do with regard to our own experience and our own beliefs about that experience. So that's Goodman. Woo! There's a lot there. I'm actually a little lightheaded. I think I've been hyperventilating from talking so much and so fast. Yeah, drink more coffee. Yeah, that's gonna help me. Absolutely. So yeah, I like, maybe I want to read a couple more quotes here in closing. I really like this part at the very, very end of the reading. Okay, so let's close off with this. I think this will be a nice end to our video lecture for tonight. Put you all to bed with a little bedtime story from Goodman. Every so often, a critic of one of my writings complains that on some topic I state without argument that something or other. A particular example I vaguely remember from somewhere reads something like, Goodman states without argument that the core of representation is denotation. This led me to reflect on why I made so crucial a declaration without argument. And the reason is that argument in any sense that involves inference from premises would be utterly inappropriate here. In such a context, I'm not so much stating a belief or advancing a thesis or a doctrine as proposing a categorization or scheme of organization, calling attention to a way of setting our nets to capture what may be significant likenesses and differences. So these subjective paradigms are kind of like this setting our nets in a certain way to accomplish some sort of goal, like catching fish. Argument for the categorization, the scheme, suggested could not be for its truth, since it has no truth value, but for its efficacy in world-making and understanding. An argument would consist rather of calling attention to important parallels between pictorial representation and verbal denotation, of pointing out obscurities and confusions that are clarified by this association, of showing how this organization works with other aspects of the theory of symbols. Basically, what Goodman, that's a bunch of fancy stuff that you may not be familiar with. He's basically like dropping certain philosophical issues and debates that get involved with the theories that he's created in the past, over the past years that he's published. But his major point here is that in each of these cases, he's just trying to show that there are certain theoretical virtues of this way of approaching things, that it serves certain pragmatic functions, that we've got theoretical questions, and his theory has the answers to those questions that are going to be satisfying for what we are looking for. That's kind of the point he's trying to make here. For a categorical system, what needs to be shown is not that it is true, but what it can do. That's kind of his point about pragmatism. And I like this quote. Put crassly, what is called for in such cases is less like arguing than selling. So it's like you want to buy this because it's going to do things for you. That's a kind of metaphor that Goodman is playing around with here. Now, I think technically he would say that's all the argument is. That's what we're doing when we're arguing. We're trying to show how certain beliefs should be adopted because they fit with our theoretical purposes better than other beliefs. That's what we're going for. And I think that it's fair to call that as a rational standard. But notice there is a big contrast between that and this kind of classical realist model of a correspondence relation. That's something kind of very, very different. So there's more to talk about here with Goodman. There's a lot going on here, but I think I'll leave it at that for tonight. I'm going to stop talking. How are you guys doing with that are in the live chat here tonight? Do you guys have any questions, some stuff that's come up tonight that you'd like to hear some more explanation about? Just want to check in with you guys before we shut things down. I always like to ask questions and see if there's things I can clarify. These video lectures kind of get into a whirlwind. All right. Okay. No questions. Hope that means I'm a good lecturer. And not that there's some other kind of confusion going on. Who knows? So maybe for all of you guys watching this video, whether live or on YouTube, reflect on Goodman. Maybe think if there's any other kinds of questions you guys have that you want to hear about. Maybe certain curiosities that we didn't get to from the reading. The reading covers a lot of ground. And I tried to hit the big highlights, the major claims that Goodman is putting out there. But if there is some other stuff that still kind of doesn't make sense, or that you are just curious about and want to ask about, I'll make for some time on Wednesday at the beginning of class and maybe answer some more questions before we go on to Williams. So we'll have some space for that. One thing in particular, actually, I wanted to put this on your radar. I actually, when I was reviewing the Goodman reading again and looking at the notes that I wrote, I actually gave you guys, gave you the wrong definition of Goodman's concept of GRU, which is a really wacky concept. GRU. GRU is not the combination of green and blue. It actually is a wackier sort of thing. And it has to do with this categorization issue, the concepts we use to categorize the world and identify properties in it. So maybe I'll talk about that on Wednesday if you guys are curious, because this video lecture is getting a little long. But so maybe we can talk about that if you're interested. And there might be some other things from the reading like that you were maybe curious about. So we'll save them for then. Have a good night, everybody, and thanks for watching.